I knew the moment the words left her mouth that something inside me had shattered for good. When my own daughter pointed at me and said I did not deserve to sit near her mother-in-law, the room went silent, but the crack inside my chest thundered loud enough to drown everything else out. Humiliation burns, but betrayal cuts deeper. And when it comes from the very person you once held, fed, carried, and protected, it leaves a wound no one can see but everyone can feel. That night, I learned that even love has breaking points, and some of them change everything. Before we dive into today's story, take a moment to share where you're watching from. We love seeing how our stories bring people together from every corner of the world. Your thoughts and comments make this community truly special, and we're grateful to have you here. If you have not already, do not forget to hit that subscribe button and turn on notifications so you never miss a new story filled with drama, resilience, and unexpected twists. Now, settle in, get comfortable, maybe grab your favorite drink, because this is a tale you will not want to miss. Let's get started. My name is Evelyn Mercer, though most people in Cape Cod still call me Eve, the way my husband used to. That morning on Seaglass Lane began the way many mornings have since I lost James, with the world outside my window wrapped in the soft gray-blue light of early dawn. A thin line of mist floated above the water, and the cry of a distant gull drifted in through the cracked kitchen window, along with the scent of salt. I stood barefoot on the cool tile floor, letting the quiet seep into my bones the way it always did before the rest of the town woke up. The ocean was steady, dependable, and calm. I liked to believe it held a piece of James somewhere out there, steadying me when the world felt too heavy. I moved through my little cottage with the muscle memory of years. The kettle hissed gently as it warmed, and I reached for the tin of Earl Grey tea that I still kept on the shelf, even though I could never brew it quite the same way he did. The wooden table by the window held the small indentations of decades of use: school papers, grocery lists, Sunday crosswords, and quiet breakfasts we once shared. I traced my fingertips along the edge before settling into my usual chair and letting the steam rise toward my face. The house around me carried his presence without ever speaking it aloud. His old navy sweater lay folded at the end of the couch. A framed wedding photo rested on the mantelpiece with colors softened by time, and his books still filled the living room shelf because I could not bear to box them away. I had taught elementary school for decades before retiring, but it was my life with James that made this home warm. When he died, the silence that followed felt like another room had been added to the house, one I could not enter without losing my breath. After finishing my tea, I stepped out onto the small porch to tend to the flower beds. The coq bien, lavender, and hydrangeas had begun to bloom beautifully this season, thriving in the sandy soil and ocean air. I clipped a few dry leaves, brushed soil from my knees, and let the breeze move gently through my hair. The rhythm of caring for the garden grounded me, reminding me that even the quietest life holds purpose if tended with patience. Around mid-morning, my phone buzzed on the kitchen counter. It was Lena. My daughter's voice carried a bright polish, the kind that comes from living in the city too long. She invited me to dinner to celebrate her husband Brad's promotion, speaking quickly as if reading from a list she needed to finish. I felt a small swell of hope warm my chest. Lena had been distant lately, pulled into a world I did not fully understand, but the invitation felt like a hand reaching back toward me. I spent the late afternoon getting ready, laying out the burgundy dress James once said made me look like autumn come to life. I brushed my hair with care, applied a light touch of powder, and slipped on the pearl earrings he had given me for our last anniversary together. As I locked the front door and stepped toward my car, the wind carried the scent of seaweed and sun-warmed sand. I paused for a moment, taking it in. I wanted this evening to be warm, simple, and full of family. I wanted to believe I still had a place at my daughter's table. If you're still watching and feeling the tension building, comment number 1 below so I know you're with me. Now, let's move on to chapter 2. Things are about to get uncomfortable. By the time I reached Lena's apartment building, the sky over the city had already settled into a muted violet. The contrast between the quiet coastline I had left behind and the polished steel and glass tower in front of me made my heart flutter with an odd mix of pride and discomfort. The doorman greeted me with professional politeness, but there was no warmth in his eyes. I followed the marble-floored hallway, the click of my shoes echoing too loudly, as if reminding me I did not quite belong in such a place. The elevator rose smoothly, the stainless steel walls reflecting a version of myself that felt painfully out of place. My burgundy dress, my careful hair, the small, hopeful smile I was trying to hold steady. When the doors opened, Lena's apartment glowed with bright white light spilling across the hallway. The space inside was stunning, designed with angles, expensive textures, and glossy surfaces that belonged on a magazine cover. It was beautiful, yes, but also put in a way I could not name. Brad greeted me first. His smile was practiced, his handshake firm in a way that suggested control rather than kindness. His shirt looked freshly pressed, and the silver watch on his wrist caught the light every time he moved. There was nothing overtly rude in his behavior, but something beneath it, a flicker of judgment in his eyes, perhaps, made me straighten my posture instinctively. Lena appeared behind him, lovely as always, but her smile was tight, stretched, as if she were holding something fragile inside her chest. Guests arrived soon after. 2 couples, both dressed in muted but unmistakably expensive attire. They carried the refined confidence of people accustomed to speaking about investment portfolios, ski resorts, and commercial design trends. I stood near the kitchen island, listening, nodding, but the conversation seemed to float around me like a language I once knew but could no longer speak fluently. When Brad announced dinner, everyone drifted toward the long dining table set with crystal glasses and gold-trimmed plates. I moved toward an empty chair near the center, but before I could sit, Brad's hand rested lightly on my forearm. The touch was soft, but the message was not. He leaned slightly toward me, lowering his voice only enough to make the words sting with intimacy. "You will be more comfortable near the kitchen." It sounded almost like a suggestion, but the pressure of his fingers told the truth. I froze, heat rising through my chest. The room fell quiet for a heartbeat. One of the women glanced at me with confusion, then quickly looked away. Lena stood behind the table, her expression collapsing into apology before she looked down at her hands. She did not speak. That silence hurt more sharply than Brad's words. I remember thinking that silence can wound just as deeply as cruelty spoken aloud. A guest attempted to break the tension by asking lightly, "Is Evelyn not joining us?" Brad responded before I could breathe. "It is better this way. She will feel out of place." The humiliation was swift and cold. I swallowed hard, steadied myself, and lifted my chin. Without a word, I reached for my purse. My voice felt fragile, so I did not trust myself to use it. I simply nodded politely toward the table and walked toward the door. The hallway outside was bright and empty. By the time the elevator doors closed, my hands were trembling. It was the kind of trembling that comes when dignity and heartbreak collide. I stepped out into the night air, letting the cold wind hit my cheeks. The streetlights shimmered on the pavement as I walked, and with each step, the sense of belonging slipped further away. I had gone there hoping for connection. Instead, I carried home the heavy knowledge that something between my daughter and me had changed in a way I did not yet understand. If this story is pulling you in and you sense something darker coming, comment number 2 below to let me know you're following closely. Now, Let's move into chapter 3, where the real cracks begin to show. I woke the next morning with the heaviness of a stone inside my chest, the kind that makes breathing feel like a slow negotiation with the world. My eyes were swollen, and when I passed the hallway mirror, I barely recognized myself. The early light coming through the kitchen windows was soft and golden, but it did nothing to warm the ache that had spread through my body since the dinner at Lena's house. I moved on autopilot, filling the kettle, reaching for my favorite mug, trying to cling to the small rituals that usually anchored me. Yet even the scent of chamomile, usually calming, felt distant and thin. When I stepped outside to fetch the morning mail, I noticed a thick envelope resting on top of the usual grocery flyers. The paper was cream-colored, the lettering embossed in dark blue. It came from a law office in Provincetown, Massachusetts, addressed directly to me with full name and middle initial. My first thought was that it must be a mistake. I did not know anyone in Provincetown, did not have any business there, and certainly did not expect correspondence from an attorney. Still, something about the envelope made my hands tremble. The formality of the letterhead, the precise weight of the paper, the seriousness of the text inside all made me pause at my kitchen counter for several minutes. The letter requested that I come in for a meeting regarding matters of inheritance and legal responsibility, stating that the issue was both urgent and directly relevant to me. I read the lines several times, feeling the confusion build. I called my friend Maggie and explained what had arrived. She urged me to go and at least hear what the attorney had to say. Her calm voice helped steady me, and within an hour I found myself driving along the curved coastline toward Provincetown. The law office, Reyes and Associates, was inside an old brick building near the waterfront. Its wooden sign was carved with delicate lettering, and the polished brass door handle gleamed in the afternoon light. Inside, everything smelled faintly of cedar. Attorney Thomas Reyes greeted me with a quiet professionalism. He was a middle-aged man with kind eyes and the sort of presence that made me feel safe enough to sit down without fear. He explained that a relative of mine, a distant cousin named Howard Jenkins, had passed away 2 years earlier. Howard, he said, had lived a quiet life investing in coastal real estate. I remembered the name vaguely from family stories told when I was young, but I had never met him. Thomas opened a large folder filled with documents and continued to explain that Howard had named me as his sole beneficiary. The words seemed unreal. Howard had left behind several properties, financial accounts, and investments. Among the holdings was a residential building located in another city, a place I had never visited but instantly recognized from the photographs. It was the very building where Lena and Brad lived. My breath caught as the reality of it sank in. Less than 24 hours earlier, I had been told to eat in the kitchen because they felt I did not belong at their table. Now, I was staring at proof that I owned the roof over their heads. Before I could gather my thoughts, Thomas handed me another envelope. This one was handwritten, sealed by Howard himself before his passing. In it, he expressed regret for losing touch with family, and wrote that he hoped the inheritance would give me strength to protect what matters and help those who cannot help themselves. I left the office carrying the folders against my chest as if they were fragile. The salty wind from the waterfront whipped at my hair as I stood beside my car, absorbing the shock of everything I had learned. The world that had felt so small and humiliating the night before had suddenly widened into something unpredictable and strange. I drove home in silence, gripping the steering wheel tightly, knowing that nothing in my life would ever look the same again, and that chapter 4 of this unfolding story was already waiting for me. If you can already feel the shift and you're curious how much deeper this goes, comment number 3 below. Now, let's step into chapter 4, where every attempt to fix things only makes them worse. The house was unusually quiet when I returned from Provincetown. the kind of quiet that makes every small sound feel amplified. The ticking of the kitchen clock echoed across the room as I stood there holding the folders from attorney Thomas Reyes. I set them carefully on the dining table, almost afraid to open them again, as if the contents might vanish if I handled them too eagerly. I finally sat down, took a deep breath, and spread the papers across the tablecloth. Seeing my name printed on so many official documents made my hands tremble again. I still felt like the same woman who had been dismissed and humiliated just the night before, but these pages suggested something very different. I began reading through every document one by one. The list of properties went on longer than I expected. There were tax forms, maintenance summaries, rental histories, and even handwritten notes from Howard about long-term plans he never had the chance to finish. The language in some sections was dense, filled with legal terminology and property management concepts I had never encountered. Still, I pushed through. The deeper I went, the more aware I became of the scale of what Howard had left behind. It was intimidating at first, but somewhere under the anxiety was a faint flicker of curiosity, perhaps even excitement. That flicker dimmed when I reached the folder labeled Building C. The first page contained a list of tenants and rental payment dates. My eyes paused at the line that read Unit 3B. The notes were blunt: several late payments, complaints from neighbors, warnings issued by the previous manager. I felt my stomach tighten when I saw that this was the unit Lena and Brad occupied. Their polished image, the brand new furniture they flaunted, their expensive vacations posted online all came into question. I sat back in my chair and tried to steady my breathing. A part of me wanted to feel shocked, but another part realized this aligned all too well with the arrogance Brad had shown. I reminded myself that reacting emotionally would only cloud my judgment. I needed clarity. I grabbed a notebook and began writing down questions. What legal responsibilities did I now have as the owner? What were my rights regarding management changes? What actions could be taken regarding problem tenants? The act of organizing my thoughts brought a sense of control that I desperately needed. I made a brief phone call to Thomas to ask for guidance about the next steps. His voice remained calm and reassuring. He mentioned that I had full authority to replace the current property manager if I wished, and that many owners prefer to take direct oversight, especially when inheriting buildings with unresolved issues. When the call ended, I sat for several minutes absorbing the significance of that information. I had the authority, not just symbolically, but legally. I returned to the documents and searched for records from the current building manager. The more I read, the more I realized how poorly the place had been maintained. Requests were ignored, repairs delayed, small disputes allowed to escalate. I could practically feel the frustration of the tenants through the typed complaints. The building deserved better, and strangely, I felt responsible for ensuring it received better. That night, I decided to take my first concrete step. I would visit the building quietly, without announcing myself, just to see things with my own eyes. I slipped the important papers into a leather folder, put on a simple coat, and drove toward the neighboring coastal city where the property was located. The drive felt long but necessary, like a threshold I had no choice but to cross. When I arrived, the building appeared older than I expected. The paint on the railings was chipped, the carpeting in the hallway was worn, and the lighting flickered unevenly. Yet beneath the neglect, I saw potential. I watched a few residents pass by, their hurried steps suggesting a place where no one expected improvements. As I walked the hallway, I paused near Unit 3B. There was muffled arguing inside, but I could not tell who was speaking. I moved on, feeling more certain than ever that things needed to change. By the time I drove home, the sky had darkened. I was exhausted, but my mind was clearer. The first attempt had not given me all the answers, but it had revealed exactly where the cracks were. If I wanted to protect myself and reclaim my dignity, I would have to take full control of what I now owned. And for the first time since that humiliating dinner, I felt ready to do just that. If the tension has you hanging on every detail, comment number 4 below so I know you're still with me. Now, let's move on to Chapter 5, where everything finally erupts. I barely slept after returning from the building. The moonlight had stretched thin across my bedroom floor, but it did nothing to soothe the uneasy rhythm of my heartbeat. I lay awake for hours, staring at the ceiling, sensing that something had shifted inside me. It was not a loud emotion, but a quiet, growing pressure, as if the walls of my life were slowly moving inward. By morning, I felt as though I had lived an entire lifetime during the night. My eyes were tired, yet my mind refused to rest. As soon as the sun rose, I found myself back at the dining table with the folders from attorney Thomas Reyes spread around me. I focused on the documents related to Building C, especially the file for Unit 3B. The financial breakdown was worse than what I had noticed the day before. Rent payments were late multiple times. There were outstanding maintenance charges and several notes from the former property manager describing confrontations with the tenant. Reading it all in black and white made the truth impossible to ignore. The polished image Lena showed the world had been built on the fragile foundation of Brad's ego and irresponsibility. The realization left a hollow ache in my chest, not only from disappointment, but from the fear that my daughter had been living inside a lie she could not see. I took another moment to gather myself before calling Thomas to clarify the next legal steps. The conversation was brief. He reaffirmed that, as the owner, I had full authority to request detailed reports on every tenant and even replace the entire management team if I wished. Hearing that made something settle inside me. The inheritance was no longer just an unexpected gift. It was a responsibility and a tool. Later that afternoon, as I set the folders aside to rest my eyes, my phone rang. It was the building manager, his voice tense and unsteady. He informed me that there was a serious problem in Unit 3B, an argument loud enough to bring multiple complaints from neighbors. I felt my heart tighten as I grabbed my coat and hurried to the car. The drive felt longer than usual, each passing mile filled with a knot of dread. When I reached the building, a small crowd had formed in the hallway outside 3B. The air was thick with tension. A lamp was lying shattered on the floor inside the unit. The manager stood near the doorway, his face red with stress. I kept my distance, blending into the background like a quiet observer. My pulse quickened as the door swung open. A young woman stepped out first. She was dressed in professional clothes, her cheeks flushed and her hair slightly undone. She avoided eye contact with the neighbors as she brushed past. Behind her stood Lena, her shoulders trembling, her expression a mixture of fury and heartbreak. Brad lingered in the background, reaching for her, visibly panicked. Even from a distance, I could read the betrayal in Lena's eyes. The young woman was not a stranger to them. The truth arrived in one silent but devastating wave. I felt my breath catch. It was one thing to suspect dishonesty, but another to witness the evidence unfold like this. A few neighbors murmured quietly. The manager gave a stern warning about calling the authorities if the argument continued. Brad looked trapped. Lena stepped away from him, her face pale. My heart ached, but the scene also ignited something sharp and cold within me. I watched as the life Lena thought she had built began to crumble right in front of her. I stepped back from the cluster of people and pressed my hand against the wall to steady myself. Looking at the scuffed hallway, the dim light, the apartment door where my daughter was falling apart, I realized with complete clarity that the time for watching was over. The power to change everything was already in my hands. I only needed to vid it. When I finally walked out to the parking lot, the sky was heavy and darkening. I stood beside my car for a long moment, letting the cool air wash over my face. My hands were trembling, but my resolve felt sharper than ever. This was the turning point, the moment everything shifted. I was no longer the woman who had been dismissed at a dinner table. I was the owner of the building, and the next day, nothing would remain the same. When I stepped back into my house after the chaos at the building, the silence felt almost unnatural, as if the world had turned down its own volume. I closed the door behind me and leaned against it, letting the weight of everything settle onto my shoulders. The memory of Lena's trembling voice, the shocked murmurs of the neighbors, and the image of that young woman slipping out of the apartment all replayed in my head like a broken reel. I walked to the living room and sat on the edge of the chair, feeling numb, unable to decide if I was more heartbroken or furious. I stared at my hands for a long time before realizing that I had reached a crossroads. Life was forcing me to choose between staying silent and stepping forward. For months, maybe even years, I had allowed myself to be pushed to the background, treated as though my worth had diminished. That night at the dinner table, when Lena said I should not sit near her mother-in-law, had carved a wound deeper than I wanted to admit. But now, watching her marriage unravel, I understood that inaction would only allow more harm to spread. Slowly, I rose from the chair and walked to the dining table. The folders were still there, neatly stacked as I had left them, but they no longer felt intimidating. They felt like tools, like keys to a door I had not dared to open. I pulled them toward me, flipping them open with a different kind of energy. Every page about Building C, every clause granting rights to the owner, every record of unpaid rent from Unit 3B, all of it sharpened my clarity. I was done being passive. I could feel the shift inside me, quiet but firm. As I reviewed the documents again, two paths came into focus. One was the path of inaction. I could let things unfold naturally, keep my distance, let Lena and Brad handle their own problems. It was the option of peace, but also the option of cowardice. The other path was confrontation, not through shouting or revenge, but through the authority and responsibility that had legally been placed in my hands. Looking at the evidence of Brad's behavior, I knew the first path would only prolong the damage. The second path, though difficult, was the only one that felt right. My phone buzzed softly, breaking the stillness. It was Maggie checking in. When I told her what I had seen earlier, her voice was gentle but steady. She reminded me that while anger was understandable, the real priority was protecting myself and Lena. Her calm words steadied the storm in my mind. She did not tell me what to do, but she helped me see that avoiding the problem would not save anyone. After the call, I noticed an email notification on my laptop. The sender was anonymous. Inside was a set of photographs showing Brad and the young woman together near the building over various days. There was no message, only the images, grainy but unmistakable. Someone in the building had seen more than I realized and wanted me to know. A shiver ran through me. The fact that someone knew who I was unsettled me, but the message was undeniably clear. Brad had been betraying Lena long before today. I sat back and remembered Howard's letter, the quiet firmness in his words urging me to protect what matters. I felt for the first time that this was not about revenge. It was about restoring balance, about setting things right. I gathered the documents related to Brad's rental violations, placing them neatly into a separate folder. Tomorrow, I would request a formal meeting. Tomorrow, I would no longer watch from the shadows. The decision had been made. That night, the house was still again, but the silence no longer felt empty. I stood before the hallway mirror and looked at my reflection, tired but resolute. My life had been reshaped by forces I could not control, but this choice, finally, was mine. Tomorrow, I would step forward. Tomorrow, I would no longer yield. If you're still watching and the weight of that choice hits you hard, comment number 6 below to let me know you felt it too. Now, let's continue with Chapter 7, where the consequences start closing in. Morning arrived slowly, as if the sun itself hesitated to rise on the aftermath of what had unfolded the previous night. I woke with a heavy tightness in my chest, the kind that settles when you know the world has shifted in ways that cannot be undone. The memory of Lena's broken expression clung to me like a shadow. I sat on the edge of my bed, listening to the silence inside the house. It was the kind of silence that made every breath feel amplified, as though the world was waiting for my next move. When I checked my phone, I saw several messages from the building manager. He had sent a detailed report of the incident, complaints from residents, descriptions of loud noises continuing well into the night, and notes about Brad showing signs of intoxication. As I scrolled, my heart sank. Each line confirmed that the situation in Unit 3B had deteriorated even further. The part of me that still cared deeply for Lena felt as though someone had gripped my heart and squeezed. Another message from the manager arrived moments later. It stated that Lena had left the apartment early that morning carrying a suitcase. A neighbor had seen her crying as she walked to her car. The image pierced through me. I wanted to call her immediately, hold her, tell her she was safe. But I knew that pressing her now might only drive her further into isolation. Sometimes, even as a mother, the hardest act of love is restraint. I placed the phone down and allowed myself a moment to process the mixture of relief and sorrow swirling inside me. At least she was not inside that toxic environment anymore. Eventually, I forced myself to prepare for the day. There was no luxury of emotional collapse. The responsibility placed on my shoulders demanded clarity, not tears. I drove to the building under a gray sky that seemed to mirror my thoughts. When I arrived, several residents glanced at me with a mixture of curiosity and unease, though none seemed to recognize me. The manager greeted me with a tired face, his posture slumped from handling too much chaos in too little time. He walked me through the events again and handed me more documents to review. One file in particular made him pause before giving it to me. Inside was a written complaint from a resident, an elderly man who described being threatened by Brad after politely requesting quiet late one night. Nothing physical had occurred, but the tone of the letter was unmistakably frightened. As I read it, a cold understanding settled over me. Brad had not only been disrespectful or irresponsible, he had been volatile. This was no longer a matter of personal betrayal. It was a pattern of dangerous behavior. I sat in the small office surrounded by a pile of reports, rental agreements, warnings, and financial statements. It felt overwhelming, yet there was clarity within the chaos. These papers were not simply formalities. They were pieces of a truth that had been building long before Lena realized anything was wrong. And if she could not see it yet, then I had to. The manager gathered additional materials, copies of security footage logs, written statements, overdue notices. He seemed relieved that someone was finally taking decisive action. I thanked him, not because I needed to be polite, but because I understood the strain he had carried while being ignored or undermined by Brad for months. With the documents gathered, I stepped outside. A crisp wind rolled down the street, tugging at my coat. I held the folder tightly against me. The weight of it was not just physical. It represented the cost of truth, the price of stepping into a role I had never expected to hold. The pain for Lena, the humiliation I had endured, the tension within the building, all of it now rested on my ability to move forward without hesitation. As I walked toward my car, I felt my resolve harden. The truth had surfaced, and the consequences were beginning to take shape. I would bear my share of the cost, but Brad would bear his as well. Tomorrow, the next phase would begin. When I returned home with the thick folder of reports and documents pressed against my side, I felt the exhaustion settle deep into my bones. It had been a long day filled with unraveling truths and gathering evidence, yet my mind had never been clearer. I set the folder on the dining table and took a slow breath. The house felt calm, almost peaceful, in stark contrast to the heavy tension I had left behind at the building. I knew the next steps would demand not only strength, but also careful, thoughtful decisions. My thoughts drifted to Lena. I imagined her somewhere alone, trying to hold herself together while pieces of her world fell apart. The instinct to go to her was immediate, but I stopped myself. She needed time to process what she had seen, time to reclaim her own sense of control. I ached for her, for the girl who once ran to me after every scraped knee and broken heart. Now, she was a woman fighting battles she never expected. I promised myself I would be there the moment she reached out, but I would not pressure her before she was ready. I sat down and opened the letter Howard had left me. The familiar handwriting steadied my breathing. His words were gentle but firm, reminding me to protect what mattered and use what he left behind, not out of anger, but purpose. For the first time since the dinner where Lena had turned away from me, I felt anchored. Howard had trusted me with more than property. He had trusted me with intention. Fueled by that clarity, I began listing what needed to be done to restore order in the building. These actions were no longer about just Brad. The residents had endured too much neglect and instability. They deserved a safer environment, a leader who cared about their well-being. I outlined steps to improve maintenance, enforce rules, resolve long-standing complaints, and replace ineffective oversight. This was about building something stable, not tearing something down. The next morning, I met with the building manager again. He looked relieved when I told him I intended to take direct control. Together, we drafted a formal notice announcing new procedures aimed at restoring safety and respect within the property. As we were finishing the draft, a soft knock sounded at the office door. An older woman entered, her hands trembling slightly. She had lived in the building for more than a decade, and the strain on her face was unmistakable. She described nights when Brad had shouted so loudly that children down the hall hid in their bathrooms. She admitted she had been too afraid to report everything. Listening to her, I felt a wave of anger and protectiveness rise inside me. This was no longer about personal justice. It was about shielding people who had never been given a voice. With renewed determination, I reviewed the strongest legal measures available. The violations were clear, the pattern undeniable. I worked with the manager to assemble the final documents needed to issue a formal warning that would serve as the last step before eviction. Each page represented accountability, long overdue yet necessary. That evening, I stood in my living room with the freshly prepared documents illuminated by soft lamplight. I felt a shift inside me, a quiet, steady strength replacing the earlier fear. I knew I was moving in the right direction. Before the night ended, I sent out the official notice of procedural changes to all residents. Finding the solution was no longer an option. It had become my responsibility. If you're still here, and you can sense the story turning toward its final truth, comment number 8 below, so I know you're ready. Now, let's move into the final chapters, where everything finds its meaning. The morning unfolded with a strange stillness, the kind that settles after a long storm has finally exhausted itself. I woke with my chest lighter, though a soft ache lingered beneath the surface, reminding me of everything that had unraveled in recent weeks. As I prepared for the day, I felt the weight of the final step ahead, the moment when the consequences of every choice, mine, Lena's, and Brad's, would take shape once and for all. When I arrived at the building, the manager had already organized the documents. He laid them out on his desk with an air of quiet relief. Every page reflected the same truth. repeated disturbances, alarming behavior, unpaid balances, and written statements from frightened tenants. There was no longer room for debate. The decision had been made by Brad long before I put it into writing. The hallway outside Unit 3B was silent when we approached. Brad emerged slowly, shoulders slumped, his eyes hollow, as if drained of every last ounce of defiance. For a moment, he simply stared at me. His voice broke the stillness only once when he whispered, "I did not think it would end this way." It was barely more than a breath, and I did not answer. The time for explanations had passed. With 2 officers and the manager present, the process unfolded quickly and without conflict. Brad gathered the last of his belongings, a few bags that looked painfully small compared to the life he had once pretended to control. As he walked down the corridor and out of the building, I felt no triumph, only the quiet understanding that some endings are meant to be somber. Later that afternoon, Lena found me near the entrance. Her posture was steadier, her gaze clearer than it had been in weeks. She told me she felt ready to close this chapter completely, ready to rebuild. We walked the grounds together, observing how calm the building had become, how residents seemed relieved without even needing to say so. By evening, Lena and I were back at my house. I made a simple dinner, and we ate together in a silence that felt comforting rather than empty. For the first time in a long while, I sensed a future forming, one built not on fear or control, but on healing. As night settled, I looked out the window and felt peace return, not perfectly, but honestly. The storm had passed. That evening, the house settled into a calm that felt almost sacred. A soft lamp glowed in the corner of the living room while I sat in my favorite chair, listening to the faint sounds of Lena moving in the room down the hall. Her quiet presence was enough to remind me that life had finally begun to mend itself. The silence no longer felt heavy. It felt earned. As I stared out the window, my mind drifted through the months that had led us here. Every wound, every fear, every moment when I wondered if I had lost my daughter forever. I remembered the sting of humiliation, the weight of being dismissed, and the ache of seeing Lena become a stranger. Yet I also remembered the strength that had risen in me, slowly but steadily, when I realized I had to fight not for revenge, but for her safety. I thought about Lena returning home, fragile yet determined, and how that single choice spoke louder than any apology. A mother never stops loving, even when her heart has been bruised. Sometimes children must walk into darkness before they can see the light waiting for them. My thoughts shifted to my own worth. I had once allowed someone to tell me I did not belong, but now I understood that dignity is not granted by others. It is reclaimed by choosing oneself again and again. As the night deepened, I felt the last traces of anger fade. I did not wish harm on Brad. I wished distance, peace, and closure. True victory was not in his downfall. It was in our freedom. Lena stepped into the living room, asking softly if I wanted tea. I nodded. Tomorrow would be a new beginning, and for the first time in a long while, I was ready for it. There are moments in life when the world forces us to stop, look inward, and rediscover the strength we forgot we carried. Pain has a way of uncovering truths we once ignored, and endings often reveal the beginning of something far more honest. Healing is not loud. It arrives in small breaths, in the quiet after chaos, when we finally understand that peace is not given by others, but chosen by ourselves. Growth asks us to let go of what breaks us, to forgive what tried to define us, and to believe that it is never too late to rise again. Every closed door teaches us something about who we are becoming.